few weeks ago, I was working and came across an audio recording of The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It had been a long time since I had read that story. So as I was listening to the story, I pulled out my book that I have of his. It's just a collection of different stories of his, science fiction stories of his. And I pulled it out and started going through, following along with the story as it was being read. And there was something interesting that came out to me in the story that I wasn't expecting. It was the contrast of this Martian invasion with some biblical imagery or Christian worldview imagery that you would see, and just the contrast between those two ideas. It was like I said, it was unexpected. I didn't think that Wells would incorporate those concepts into this story of a Martian invasion. He doesn't write it in overtly, but he kind of sprinkles it through in different areas in the story, and in a few different elements. One of those being the pastoral setting of the book. The story is told. It's set mainly in the English countryside. And we're talking, turn of the century, from 19th to 20th century. So this is before the age of automobiles, even, or maybe few automobiles, but depending on the actual year that it was written. But it's English countryside, so we're talking more, farms, fences on the hillsides, cattle, sheep dotting those hillsides, small English villages, workaday people, farmers, laborers, your idyllic English countryside at the time. Another element he writes in there is actual biblical references or biblical quotations that he writes in, especially at the end of the book. He drops those in there, and it's very striking when in contrast to what you've read about the Martians and the destruction that they have wrought. And then another element is prayers that are offered to God, especially by different characters in the book, especially the main character, the narrator. It's told from a first-person viewpoint. The narrator, he makes several prayers in there, and it's interesting to contrast that with that worldview of a man who's I don't think the narrator really believes in God, but he uses these prayers. It's kind of a fallback, in a sense. We're looking at, again, the English countryside at the turn of the last century, or 2 centuries ago now at this point. And this is a worldview of people who are churchgoers. They have a certain worldview that they're working in, this Christian worldview probably specifically, and yet how do you reconcile that with the attack by Martians? These beings from Mars. There's no Martians in the Bible, so how do you reconcile those two things? So that's how or why those images were striking when you read the story. Those elements come out in 3 main characters, I think. I mentioned the narrator. Another is the curate that the narrator meets in his travels, in his wanderings. And then another character is the artilleryman, whom he also meets. So the pastoral setting of the English countryside. One element that is written in there that into that setting is that all of this, the main action of the story takes place on a Sunday. So again, we're going to have churchgoers, people attending, farmers, laborers attending church in the morning, and then here, as the day plays out, the Martians are coming out of these cylinders that have dropped to Earth, and they're wreaking havoc as they go, destroying whole villages and stuff. Another element is the concept of church bells or church towers. Church towers themselves appear, I counted them, they appear 19 times in the story. Wells references them 19 times. Now, some of them are going to be like props, that Wells has to incorporate. Here we are, again, turn of the century, before the age of the telephone even. So to get communication from one town to another, if a town wants to warn a neighboring town of something that's happening, they're going to start ringing the church bells. So in terms of ringing the bells, to alert other towns around them, let's see here. Just a quick little passage here. It says, from Ripley until I came through Pryford, I was in the valley of the way, and the red glare was hidden from me. As I ascended the little hill behind Pyrford Church, the glare came into view again, and the trees about me shivered from the first intimation of the storm that was upon me, the storm being the attack of the Martians. And I heard the midnight pealing from the Pryford Church behind me, and then came the silhouette of the Mayberry Hill with its treetops and roofs black and sharp against the red. So it's kind of a pictorial comparison. Again, the church, the church bell, the church tower. Here we have the church tower, the element of human faith in God, contrasted with this attack by the Martians, which with these people, no concept of Martians probably ever entered their minds. So how do they reconcile that to their Christian faith? Another quick one in terms of using the church towers as props. Here's another little village. I don't know if it even mentions which one it is. The bells of the neighboring church made a jangling tumult. A cart, carelessly driven, smashed amid shrieks and curses against the water trough up the street. Sickly yellow lights went to and fro in the houses, some of them passing cabs flaunted unextinguished lamps, and overhead the dawn was growing brighter, clear and steady and calm. So another pictorial, image of destruction that's happening because of the Martians, and yet it's incorporating the church bells in there, the ringing, the jangling of the church bells, probably a discordant sound, using the church bells to raise as much ruckus as they can to warn people of something that's happening. Now, there's multiple times where church bells or church towers are destroyed, which I find interesting because, again, we're contrasting, that pastoral setting with the attack by the Martians, and here the Martians are coming. Specifically, Wells writes in there, the destruction of those church towers. About 6 in the evening, as I sat at tea with my wife in the summer house, I heard a muffled detonation from the common, and immediately afterwards a gust of firing. Close on the heels of that came a violent rattling crash quite close to us. It shook the ground. Starting out upon the lawn, I saw the tops of the trees about Oriental College burst into smoky red flame, and the tower of the little church behind it began to slide down into ruin. So this is early on in the story, before the narrator is separated from his wife. He spends most of his time in the story struggling along amidst this destruction and chaos, trying to hide from the Martians, separated from his wife. So this is just early on in the story, and we see this initial destruction of the church tower. But yet another destruction. The one that we just read was probably in his hometown, the narrator's hometown. Now, in this instance, the war is in full swing. They are starting to fight back against the Martians, with what little power they have. The Martian within the hood was slain and slashed to the four winds of heaven, and the thing was now a mere intricate device of metal whirling to destruction. It drove along in a straight line, incapable of guidance. It struck the tower of the Shepperton Church, smashing it down as the impact of a battering ram might have done. The Martians move about in these tripods. Think of like AT-ATs from Star Wars. They're in these tripods. It says like it calls them tripods. They have feet that they use that are tall like AT-ATs, and they walk around with these things. So the Martian was slain, and therefore the tripod was kind of willy-nilly on its own, smashing into a church in this case. And then just one more reference about the destruction of a church tower. This is later on in the story. This isn't so much specific to a church tower. It says, as I looked at this wide expanse of houses and factories and churches, silent and abandoned, as I thought of the multitudinous hopes and efforts, the innumerable hosts of lives that had gone into building this human reef, and the swift and ruthless destruction that had been hung over it all, I realized that the shadow had been rolled back and that men might still live in the streets. And this clear, vast, dead city of mine be once more alive and powerful. So I mentioned that it was later on in the story. This is when the Martians have been overcome, not by people, we'll see that later, but they have been destroyed. And here the narrator is looking over the destruction that they have caused and yet finding hope. It's interesting how he references the fellowship of man, in this passage. Men might still live in the streets, and a little bit earlier, the lives that have gone into building this human reef, he calls it, contrasting the humanity, that we see in this English setting with this Martian invasion that's coming. That's a good passage to transition on, because part of the elements that we see elsewhere, especially with the characters that I mentioned, are how does humanity, specifically these three different people, how do they deal with the destruction that they're seeing from the Martians? I mentioned again the narrator being one. It says we can kind of look at this passage and see what his viewpoint is, how he internalizes this destruction, based just on that little paragraph there. But then there's also the two other main characters that the narrator meets in the story. I think I mentioned it, but he starts the story in, he has his own livelihood in his little town that he lives in. And yet here comes the destruction of the Martians. He's separated from his wife. He's separated from a lot of different people. Just imagine the Martians coming, starting to destroy things. People have no power against the destructive force of these Martians. And so they flee. They just are scattered throughout the countryside. A lot of them fleeing to London. So the narrator is on his own through much of the story. He falls in with a few smaller groups of people. He hears a little bit about some of their story. But the two main people he falls in with are the curate and then the artilleryman. And each of those two have a different worldview that they're operating under. They each respond to the destruction in different ways. The curate is the first man that he falls in with. And I want to read a little bit about the curate and the curate's perspective, the curate's response to this. And I'm just going to read some of the passage so you get a feel for, what the curate's personality is and how he responds. I do not clearly remember the arrival of the curate, so that probably I dozed. became aware of him as a seated figure in soot-smudged shirt sleeves, and with his upturned, clean-shaven face staring at a faint flickering that danced over the sky. The sky was what is called a mackerel sky, rows and rows of faint down plumes of cloud, just tinted with the midsummer sunset. I sat up, and at the rustle of my motion, he looked at me quickly. "You any water?" I asked abruptly. He shook his head. "You've been asking for water for the last hour," he said. For a moment we were silent, taking stock of one another. I dare say he found me a strange enough figure, naked, save for my water-soaked trousers and socks, scalded, and my face and shoulders blackened by smoke. He had taken off his shirt to seek refuge in the river. That's why he had no shirt there. His face was a fair weakness. His chin retreated, and his hair lay in the crisp, almost flaxen curls on his low forehead. His eyes were rather large, pale blue, and blankly staring. He spoke abruptly, looking vacantly away from me. "What does it mean?" he said. What do these things mean?" I stared at him and made no answer. He extended a thin white hand and spoke in almost a complaining tone. "Why are these things permitted? What sins have we done? This morning, the morning service is over. I was walking through the roads to clear my brain for the afternoon, and then fire, earthquake, death. As if all were Sodom and Gomorrah, all of our work undone. What are these Martians?" "What are we?" I answered, clearing my throat. He gripped his knees and turned to look at me again. For half a minute, perhaps, he stared silently. "I was walking through the roads to clear my brain," he said. "Suddenly, fire, earthquake, and death." He relapsed into silence, with his chin now almost sunken to his knees. Presently, he began waving his hand. "All the work, all the Sunday schools. What have we done? What has Weybridge done? Everything gone. Everything destroyed. The church. We rebuilt it only 3 years ago. It's gone. Swept out of existence. Why?" Another pause, and he broke out again like one demented. "The smoke of her burning goeth up forever and ever," he shouted. His eyes flamed, and he pointed a lean finger in the direction of Weybridge. By this time I was beginning to take his measure. The tremendous tragedy in which he had been involved, it was evident he was a fugitive from Weybridge, had driven him to the very verge of his reason. "Are we far from Sunbury?" I asked in a matter-of-fact tone. "What are we to do?" he asked. "Are these creatures everywhere? Has the earth been given over to them?" "Are we far from Sunbury?" "Only this morning I officiated at their early celebration." "Things have changed," I said quietly. "You must still keep your head. There's still hope." "Hope?" "Yes, plentiful hope for all this destruction." I began to explain my view of our position. He listened at first, but as I went on, the interest drawing in his eyes gave place to their former glare, and his regard wandered from me. This must be the beginning of the end," he said, interrupting me. "The end, the great and terrible day of the Lord, when men shall call upon the mountains and rocks to fall upon them and hide them from him who sits upon the throne." I began to understand the position. I ceased my laboring reasoning, struggled to my feet, and standing over him, laid my hand on his shoulder. "Be a man," I said. "You're scared out of your wits. What good is religion if it collapses under calamity? Think of what earthquakes and floods and wars and volcanoes have done before this. Do you think that God has exempted Weybridge? He's not an insurance agent." For a time he sat in blank silence. "But how can we escape?" he asked suddenly. "They are invulnerable. They're pitiless." "Neither one nor perhaps the other," I answered. "And the mightier they are, the more sane and wary we should be. One of them was killed yonder not 3 hours ago." So here we have a curate. The narrator says he's gone to the verge of his sanity, having seen the destruction that's been caused. And yet the narrator has seen plenty of destruction too. So why is it that these two men respond so differently to what's going on? A curate is, I had to look it up, a curate is a person who assists the parish vicar, like the priest, with his day-to-day duties. The curate is often one that's going out assisting the people in the parish, if they have needs, maybe attending on the sick, visiting elderly, interacting with the people of the parish. You would think, imparting hope to them. If he's in that role, he's imparting hope to them. He's relaying maybe the messages of hope from the vicar, or even messages of hope from his own studies of the scriptures and of God. God being the source of all hope. He should be a man who's capable of doing that, which is sad, because here we see a man much the opposite of that, not imparting hope, giving into despair, misquoting the scriptures, I might add. So, it's interesting to see how Wells wrote the curate. Wells, I'm sure, was not much of a Christian man. I know, I read a little bit about Wells in terms of the story. I know that he had plenty of, biblical training, but I think he probably set aside his own Christian views early on in his path through life. But he had plenty of biblical knowledge, plenty of Christian knowledge, and yet he writes the curate in such a fashion, which to me was kind of disappointing, because I would hope that a curate would have a better head on his shoulders. The narrator, as we go through the story, the narrator has a much more level-headed approach to what's going on, to what's happening. He does give in to some of his emotions and fears at times, but he never gets to the point where the curate is. Let me read a little bit more about the curate and see how he just goes downhill. When the narrator and curate meet up, they decide, well, let's join together, we'll wander together, because it's better to be together than to be separated from somebody and such destruction that's going on. So they're wandering together. At one point, they take refuge in this house as the Martians are coming through the countryside. And while they're in the house, there is a great catastrophe that happens where the house kind of gets smashed on one side. I think it might even tilt up a little bit. And what had happened was one of the cylinders, Wells calls them cylinders. It's essentially the spaceship, the torpedo, I don't know. It's like a cylinder, it's how he describes it. It comes down on Earth and it hits right next to that house as it impacts the Earth. And that's how the Martians are transporting to Earth. It's not a crash, it's something, that's how they land. So the cylinder strikes, and they're in this house. They're kind of trapped, because the Martians then come out of their cylinder and are starting to work around constructing things that they brought with them, maybe the tripods or other weaponry that they brought along. So the Martians are in this crater. The Martians are in this crater, working on different things. The narrator and artilleryman and curate are trapped in the house. They are keeping very silent, trying not to make too much noise, because they've already discovered at this point that the Martians will eat people. So they don't want to be found by the Martians. So while they're in this house, the curate just goes further downhill. He eventually loses his reasoning altogether. So a quick little passage here, while they're trapped in the house. The fact is that we had absolutely incompatible dispositions and habits of thought and action, and our danger and isolation only accentuated the incompatibility. At Halliford, I had already come to hate the curate's trick of helpless exclamation, his stupid rigidity of mind, his endless muttering monologue vitiated every effort I made to think out a line of action, and drove me at times thus pent up and intensified, almost to the verge of craziness. He would weep for hours together, and I verily believed that to the end of his spoiled child to the end of this spoiled child of life, thought his weak tears in some way efficacious. And I would sit in the darkness, unable to keep my mind off of him by reason of his importunities. He ate more than I did, and it was only in vain I pointed out that our only chance of life was to stop up the house until the Martians had done with their pit, that in long patience of time it might presently come that we should need food. He ate and drank impulsively, in heavy meals and long intervals. He slept little. As the days wore on, his utter carelessness of any consideration so intensified our distress and danger that I had, much as I loathed to do it, to resort to threats and at last to blows. That brought him to reason for a little time, but he was one of those weak creatures, void of pride, timorous, anemic, hateful souls, full of shifty cunning, who face neither God nor man, and who face not even themselves. So the last sentence right there in a nutshell, it kind of goes back to what I was saying. You would hope and expect a curate, a man trained in the service of the parish and the service of God, to be a better man. And then the last passage I wanted to read of the curate. And so our widened incompatibility ended at last in open conflict. For the vast 2 days we struggled in undertones and wrestling contests. There were times when I beat and kicked him madly, times when I cajoled and persuaded him. And once I tried to bribe him with the last bottle of Burgundy, for there was a rainwater pump from which I could get water. But neither force nor kindness availed. He was indeed beyond reason. He would neither desist from his attacks on the food, nor from the noisy babbling to himself. The rudimentary precautions to keep our imprisonment endurable he would not observe. So slowly I began to realize the complete overthrow of his intelligence, to perceive that my sole companion in this close and sickly darkness was a man insane. Just one more paragraph. And from certain vague memories, I am inclined to think that my own mind wandered at times, had strange and hideous dreams whenever I slept. It sounds paradoxical, but I am inclined to think that the weakness and the insanity of the curate warned me, braced me, and kept me as a sane man. From there on, the curate just goes, like I said, he goes downhill. He never fully loses his mind, I don't think, but his last act was to threaten that he's going out to alert the Martians to their presence, which would be certain death. So he was actually going to take that action. The narrator, what he does is comes up behind him. I think he was going to kill him with a hatchet or something that they found in the house. But it does say in a last act of mercy, he turns the hatchet blunt end down and strikes him on the head. So I don't think he killed the man, but he rendered him unconscious. And the commotion of that act alerted the Martians. The narrator hid in the farthest recess of the house he could find. The Martians are these tentacled creatures, kind of like octopuses, I think he calls them, with long tentacles. And these tentacles come into the house and they're searching out the curate, and they discover the curate and drag him out of the house. And that's the end of the curate. I guess I just wanted to point out all of that. The curate's response to the situation, and I think it was unfortunate that Wells had to use a curate of all people to have such a response to the situation. The artilleryman is of a vastly different nature. It's interesting to see his response to things. The narrator did not spend as much time with the artilleryman. They hung out a little bit. I think at one point the narrator was kind of being drawn in by the artilleryman's approach to things, by his attitude and his ideologies. But at one point, the narrator's like, "I can see right through you, buddy. That's not going to work. I'm leaving, and he left the artilleryman. We don't know what happened to the artilleryman after that. They did not spend a lot of time together. So let me just read the artilleryman. It's a longer passage, but I think it's good because you really get a sense of who this artilleryman guy is. So again, they fall in together. They're spending some time together. And the artilleryman is relating his own viewpoint to the narrator. I mean that men like me are going to go on living for the sake of the breed. I tell you, I'm grim set on living. And if I'm not mistaken, you'll show what your insides are too before long. We aren't going to be exterminated, and I don't mean to be caught either, and tamed and fattened and bred like thundering ox. Ugh, fancy those brown creepers. You don't mean to say. I do. I'm going on. Under their feet. I've got it all planned. I've thought it out. We men are beat. We don't know enough. We've got to learn before we got a chance. And we've got to live and keep independent what we learn. See? That's what has to be done. I stared, astonished, and stirred profoundly by the man's resolution. Those who mean to escape their catching must get ready. I'm getting ready, mind you. It isn't all of us that are made for wild beasts, and that's what it's got to be. That's why I watched you. I had my doubts. You're slender. I didn't know what it was, you see, or just how you'd be buried. All these, the sorts of people that lived in the houses and all these damn little clerks that used to live down the way, they'd be no good. They haven't any spirit in them. No proud dreams and no proud lusts, and a man who hasn't one or the other. What is he but funk and precautions? They've just used to skedaddle off to work. I've seen hundreds of them. Been a breakfast in the hand, running wildly and shining to catch their little season ticket train, for fear that they'd get dismissed if they didn't. Working at businesses that they were afraid to take the trouble to understand, skedaddling back for fear that they wouldn't be in time for dinner, keeping indoors after dinner for fear of back streets, and sleeping with their wives they married, not because they wanted them, but because they had a bit of money that would make them for safety in their little miserable skedaddle through the world. Lives insured and a bit invested for fear of accidents. And on Sundays, fear of the hereafter, as if hell were built for rabbits. Well, the Martians just will be a godsend to them. Nice roomy cages, fattened food, careful breeding, no worry. After a week or so of chasing about the fields and lands on empty stomachs, they'll come and be caught cheerful. They'll be quite glad after a bit. They'll wonder what people did before they were Martians to take care of them. And the bar loafers and mashers and singers, I can imagine them, he said with a sort of somber gratification. They'll be like any amount of sentiment and religion loose among them. There's hundreds of things I saw with my eyes that I've only begun to see clearly in the last few days. There's lots that will take things as they are, fat and stupid, and lots will be worried by a sort of feeling that it's all wrong, that they ought to be doing something. Now, whenever things are so that a lot of people feel that they ought to be doing something, the weak and those who go weak with a lot of complicated thinking always make for a sort of do-nothing religion, very pious and superior, and submit to persecution and the will of the Lord. Very likely you've seen the same thing. It's energy in a gale of funk, and turned clean inside out. These cages will be full of psalms and hymns and piety, and those of a little bit less simple sort will work in a bit. These marshals make pets of some of them, train them to do tricks. Who knows, get sentimental over the pet boy who grew up and had to be killed. And some, maybe, will train to hunt us. No, that's impossible, I cried. No human being. What's the good of us going on with such lies, said the artilleryman. There's men who do cheerful. What nonsense to pretend there isn't. And here I succumbed to his conviction. If they come after me, he said. If they come after me, and subsided into a grim meditation. I sat contemplating these things. I could find nothing to bring against this man's reasoning. In the days before the invasion, no one would have questioned my intellectual superiority to his. I, a professed and recognized writer on philosophical themes, and he, a common soldier, and yet who had already formulated a situation that I had scarcely realized. What are you doing? I asked presently. What plans have you made? He hesitated. Well, it's like this, he said. What have we got to do? We have to invent a sort of life where man can live and breed and be sufficiently secure to bring the children up. Yes, wait a bit. I'll make it clearer when I think what ought to be done. The tame ones will go on like all tame beasts. In a few generations, they'll be big, beautiful, rich-blooded, stupid rubbish. The risk is that we who have to go wild will go savage, degenerate, sort of, like into a sort of big savage rat. You see, I mean to live underground. I've been thinking about the drains. Of course, those who don't know about drains think them horrible things. But under this London are miles and miles, hundreds of miles. In a few days' rain, and London will empty and leave them sweet and clean. The main drains are big enough and airy enough to be for anyone. And then there's cellars and vaults and stores from which bolting passages may be made into the drains. And the railway tunnels and the subways, eh? You begin to see? And here we form a band, an able-bodied, clean-minded men. Gotta go on picking in rubbish, and we're not going to pick in any rubbish that drifts in. Weaklings go out again. As you meant me to go? Well, I partly, didn't I? Well, we won't quarrel about that, I said. Go on. Those who stop and obey orders, able-bodied, clean-minded women we will also want, mothers and teachers, no lackadaisical ladies, no blasted rolling eyes. Can't have any weak or silly people. Life is real again, and the useless and cumbersome and mischievous have to die. They ought to die. They ought to be willing to die. It's a sort of disloyalty, after all, to live and taint the race. They can't be happy. Moreover, dying's done so dreadful. It's the funking that makes it all bad. In those places we should all gather. Our district will be London, and we may even be able to keep watch and run about in the open when the Martians keep away. Play cricket, perhaps. That's how we shall save the race, eh? It's a possible thing, but saving the race is nothing in itself. As I say, it's only being rats. It's savage. It's saving our knowledge and adding to it that is the thing. There's men like you that come in. There's books, and there's models. We must make great safe places down deep and get all the books we can. Not novels and poetry swipes, but ideas and science books. That's where men like you come in. We must go to the British Museum and pick up all those books. Especially we must keep our science and learn more. We must watch those Martians. Some of us must go in as spies. When it's all working, perhaps I will. Get caught, I mean. And then the great thing is, we must leave the Martians alone. We mustn't even steal. We must not get in their way. We clear out. If we get in their way, we clear out. We must show them we mean no harm. Yes, I know, but they're intelligent things. They won't hunt us down if we think they have all they want. All right, that was a long passage. I was getting tired of reading. But a totally different mindset that the artilleryman has. So here's the curate who can't seem to fathom what's going on, and he just gives in to despair. And in a sense, comparing the artilleryman, he's probably despairing in a sense, but he's willing to acknowledge that life has changed dramatically, and there has to be a new way of living. It's very much like survival of the fittest, as you can tell from his viewpoint. He refers to some people as weak and of not being worthy to be part of their group. They're going to get kicked out, and it's their own fault almost. It's very, very. It's very little regard for the overall sanctity of human life. The next thing I wanted to look at are the prayers of the narrator. As I mentioned, the narrator does struggle from time to time with the destruction that he's dealing with, as he sees the destruction around him. He does struggle with some of that. He does come to points of despair, but he always gets past those points, unlike the curate, unlike the artilleryman, who both deal with those trials in different ways that are not realistic. The narrator, he keeps coming back to a realistic, level-headed frame of mind. But he does run into points where he is in very much despairing of his situation. So I just wanted to look at a few of those prayers that he offers. Okay, the first, when I mentioned when that he and the curate are trapped in the house, the curate, he knocked the curate senseless. The Martians are feeding into the house, trying to find what that commotion was, and he's the narrator is hiding in the back. He actually, I believe there's a bunch of rubbish back there. I don't remember what it was, but he tunnels himself under the rubbish to make sure that he's hidden from the feeding tentacles of the Martians. While he's back there, he offers a prayer to God. Oh, here we go. I crept back to the coal cellar, shut the door, and began to cover myself with as much as I could. I guess it was coal. And as noiselessly as possible in the darkness, among the firewood and coal. Every now and then I paused, rigid, to hear if the Martian had thrust its tentacles through the opening again. Then the faint metallic jingle returned. I traced it slowly, feeling over the kitchen. Presently I heard it nearer in the scullery, as I judged. I thought that its length might be insufficient to reach me. I prayed copiously. It passed, scraping faintly across the cellar floor. An age of almost intolerable suspense intervened. It's funny, I made a comment in the side of the page. It says, I prayed copiously, I circled those words. And I said, to whom, to what? You've shown your disregard for God. I haven't brought it out much, the narrator's overall religious views or views on humanity and who God might be. I haven't really touched on it much, but I think there are instances where he has shown his disregard for God in the things that he has expressed up till this point, and yet here he is still praying. And I think that's human nature. For anyone in a dire situation, they will pray. And so it's realistic of Wells to write that into praying copiously, even though the narrator might not have much of a belief in God. Wells acknowledges that it's human nature. Everyone is going to do that when they're in dire situations. Maybe not everyone, but a lot of people will resort to prayers when they're struggling with things. Another instance. After the Martians die is what I noted on my paper. The narrator prays as well. This is part of what I read earlier, where we read, I realized that the shadow had been rolled back and that men might still live in the streets. This clear, vast, dead city of mine be once more alive and powerful. I felt a wave of emotion that was near akin to tears. The torment was over. Even that day, the healing would begin. This is after the Martians have died. Even that day, the healing would begin. The survivors of the people scattered over the country, leaderless, lawless, foodless, like sheep without a shepherd. The 1,000 who had fled by sea would begin to return. The pulse of life, growing stronger and stronger, would beat again in the empty streets and pour across the vacant squares. Whatever destruction was done, the hand of the destroyer was stayed. All the gaunt wrecks, the blackened skeletons of houses that stared so dismally at the sunlit grass of the hill, would presently be echoing with the hammers of the restorers and ringing with the tapping of their trowels. As I thought, I extended my hands towards the sky and began thanking God. In a year, I thought, in a year. So, not similar to the first one, not a written out prayer, but here he is, the narrator, praying again. this time prayers of thankfulness. And probably similar to the other instance, he's in despair. He's not sure if the Martians are going to find him, and if they find him, they will eat him. So, that's got to be very alarming, very disconcerting. So in that situation, he's very emotionally distraught. And then on the flip side, here he is realizing that the Martians have all died, and there is hope for humanity after all. And these are prayers of joy and exaltation, because of realizing what they have come through and what they no longer have to deal with, these destructive Martians. And then one last one. This actually is going back a few pages, I guess. Oh, this one was an interesting one. He is struggling with he has made it out of the house where he was trapped with the curate. He's struggling with the fact that he may have led the curate to his death by knocking him unconscious and allowing the Martians to get him. All right. By an effort, I had set aside that picture of a prostrate body meeting the curate. I faced the problem of the Martians and the fate of my wife. For the former, I had no data. I could imagine 100 things, and so unhappily I could also for the latter, meaning his wife. And suddenly that night became terrible. I found myself sitting up in bed, staring at the dark. I found myself praying that the heat ray may have suddenly and painlessly struck her out of being. Since that night of my return from Leatherhead, I had not prayed. I had uttered prayers, fetish prayers, and had prayed as heathens mutter charms when I was in the extremity. But now I prayed indeed, pleading steadfastly and sanely, face to face with the darkness of God. Strange night, strangest in this, that so soon that dawn had come. I, who had talked with God, crept out of the house like a rat leaving its hiding place, a creature scarcely larger, an inferior animal, a thing that for my passing whim of our masters might be hunted and killed. Perhaps they had also prayed confidently to God. Surely, if we have learned nothing else, this war had taught us pity for those witless souls who suffer our dominion. This is a very interesting passage. He kind of lapses into eloquence there, Wells does, as he writes that. Maybe not Wells, maybe the narrator, I should say. Because here's the narrator set, and that goes into Wells, his adeptness at writing, these types of things, because he can see the situation the narrator's in. He's got all of these very overwhelming situations. The fact that he may have led the curate to his death. The fact that he's separated from his wife, he has no idea what has happened to her. Could you imagine being afraid that the Martians would capture your wife and eat her? That's got to be, because he says, imagine so many different outcomes of what's happening, and that's why he prayed that, perhaps she might just be killed by the death ray, or not the death ray, what is it called? The heat ray that the Martians use to destroy things. Just so many different challenges and so many different emotions that he has to deal with. And so here he is praying. I find it interesting that he says he had not prayed. He had uttered prayers, fetish prayers, prayed as heathens mutter charms. Maybe he was doing that in the house when the Martian was there. He just says he prayed copiously. And in such a situation where he's not, in this case, he's safe in a house. He found a bed that he was able to sleep in. He has somewhat in a situation of safety. And so he's able to not relax, so to speak, but have that time and that sense of safety where he can reflect on things and be in a position where he might be able to spell out his thoughts and his words to God. Whereas in the house with the tentacles of the Martians feeling around for him, you're like hyper focused on one thing, so praying copiously might be those fetish prayers that he was mentioning here. But here in this situation, he is pleading steadfastly and sanely, face to face with the darkness of God. I found that phrase, the darkness of God, very interesting, because you take any Christian, and the Christian would say that God is light. It says that in the Bible. It says that in the scriptures. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. And yet Wells writes it, the darkness of God. And it's quite an image, really, to have that. Because I think probably here's a man, the narrator, the man who, is very, as we see earlier in the book, he's very humanistic. His ideologies about life and about the world, very humanistic. And so he probably does not have a good grasp of who God is as he's revealed in the scriptures and as God is revealed to people one-on-one. People can talk to God and God can talk to them. And the narrator probably, to me, I think he comes across as a person who doesn't really talk to God much. And so, if he's there in this duress of emotion in this house that he found, and he's talking with God, finally talking, maybe truthfully, maybe real in a real sense for the first time in his life, his perspective of God might be God is a God of darkness, because is it oh yeah, it's right there, the strangest night that so soon at dawn had come, I who had talked with God crept out of the house. So he's in there in the darkness, in the dark of that setting, dealing with his emotions and his fears, and it's dark. It's visibly, physically dark around him. It's nighttime, and so that might be why he says, face to face with the darkness of God, because it's just dark. It's an interesting picture. I just find it a very interesting picture that Wells writes. He could say the truth of God. He could say the immensity of God, the reality of God, but he says the darkness of God. And it's interesting to me because, like I said, God is not darkness. He is light. In him, there is no darkness at all. The last thing I wanted to look at are the scriptural references that I mentioned earlier. We just saw one in that passage. Which one was that? Let me go back and see. Oh yeah, like sheep without a shepherd. So several times in the Old Testament, in the Bible, it refers to the Israelites as being scattered by invading nations that are coming in. And they're referred to as sheep without a shepherd. I have a Bible here. I'm gonna read specifically some of these passages. Bear with me. I gotta find them. Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "May the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over this congregation, who will go out and come in before them, and who will lead them and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord will not be like sheep, which have no shepherd." So here's Moses passing on his leadership to Joshua, and referring to the Israelites as sheep, and that they would not be without a shepherd. Another one. When he came to the king said to him, Micaiah, shall we go to Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall we refrain? And he answered him, Go up and succeed, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king. Then the king said to him, How many times must I adjure you to speak to me nothing but the truth of the name of the Lord? So he said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep which have no shepherd. And the Lord said, These have no master. Let each of them return to his house in peace. I do not know. This is from First Kings. So there's a lot of stories in First Kings. So I'm not sure exactly what this story is. But again, it's a reference to Israel, like being like sheep which have no shepherd. And then in the New Testament, I don't believe there's any direct reference to those words, like sheep without a shepherd. But at one point, it does say of Jesus that he has compassion on Israel because they are like sheep without a shepherd. I don't know what to make of it within the story of the War of the Worlds. In this case, to read it again, the survivors of the people scattered over the country, leaderless, lawless, foodless, not floodless, like sheep without a shepherd. The thousands who had fled by sea would begin to return. I mean, in similar fashion, the Israelites were scattered now and then to different distant countries and different distances of Israel, like sheep without a shepherd. They had no cohesion. They had no one to lead them. So maybe that's why he wrote that in there. The whole fact being, though, that in 3 or 4 instances in the end of the War of the Worlds, Wells drops in these biblical phraseologies. The next one to mention is it's not a phrase, it's a reference. It's a reference to a story about Sennacherib, the king of the Assyrians. And the story in the Bible is that Assyria is coming to attack Israel. Hezekiah, the king of Israel at the time, he pleads to God to save them from Assyria. And there's the army of Assyria that's camped, Sennacherib being their king, camped around Jerusalem, perhaps, I don't remember exactly, and going to attack. And then in the middle of the night, the angel of the Lord comes and wipes out the Assyrians, so Israel is saved. So the reference to Sennacherib, let me find it here, is falls right after the Martians have been destroyed. And it says, here and there they were scattered, nearly 50 together in the great gulf that they had made, overtaken by a death that must have seemed to them as incomprehensible as any death could be. To me also at this time, death was incomprehensible. All I knew was that these things that had been alive and so terrible to men were dead. For a moment I believed that the destruction of Sennacherib had been repeated, that God had repented, and that the angel of death had slain them in the night. I didn't write this down to mention, but I do want to mention it. Earlier, just before this passage, the narrator describes how the Martians were destroyed. It says, the Martians, dead, slain by the putrefaction and disease, bacteria against which their systems were unprepared, slain as the red weed among them was being slain, slain after all man's devices had failed by the humblest things that God in his wisdom had put upon the earth. They were slain by just general bacteria that's found on Earth that human beings are able to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and yet the Martians, having never encountered this bacteria before, could not overcome. And the bacteria is in the end what killed them. But going back to Sennacherib, not a direct reference, but a story taken from the Bible. Um, that the Martians were killed, maybe not directly by the angel of the Lord, but by something that God in His wisdom had put upon the earth. The last passage, couple passages from biblical passages I want to look at are in one paragraph in the story, very near the very end of the book. It says, "It may be that across the immensity of space, the Martians have watched the fate of these pioneers of theirs and learned their lesson, and that on the planet Venus they have found a secure settlement. Be that as it may, for many years there will be certainly no relaxation of the eager scrutiny of the Martian disk, and the fiery darts of the sky and the shooting stars will bring with them as they fall an unavoidable apprehension to all the sons of men." So the two items that I see in there being the fiery darts and the phrase all the sons of men. And the fiery darts comes from a New Testament book, Ephesians. It says it's the author of Ephesians cautioning believers to take up the shield of faith, with which you will be able to quench the fiery darts of the evil one. In the biblical passage, Paul, the author, is talking about the shield of faith, your faith, belief in God, with which you will extinguish or block the fiery darts of the evil one, being Satan, the adversary of believers, and the fiery darts being probably temptations and trials that come your way. So if you compare that with what Wells writes here, the fiery darts of the sky, the shooting stars, much more realistic. In this story, they were realistic. They were real physical things that the people had to deal with. The cylinders falling from the sky, containing Martians who were out to destroy humans. So similar in that sense. That there's the dealing with humanity and having this outside force attacking you, whether it's Satan attacking you by metaphysical means or by intangible means, or in this case another outside attack on humanity, the fiery darts from the sky, the Martians coming down to Earth. And then the last one, all the sons of men, I found was an interesting one. Interesting because as I read the story, or as I listened to the story and made notes on it, I recognized that phrase, the sons of men. It sounded biblical to me, so I did a quick search on it. And that phrase, the sons of men, is found mostly in the Psalms, and mostly the phrase is referring to all humanity, but more specifically to the portion of humanity that does not believe in God, does not give God credit for who He is. So that's why I found it interesting, is that I'm not sure why Wells utilized that phrase. The shooting stars will bring with them as they fall an unavoidable apprehension to all the sons of men. In the story, when the first cylinder came down, actually before that, they saw the bright flashes from Mars. That's why they're called Martians, because they come from Mars. Never mentioned that, but that's why they're called the Martians, because they're looking at, humans are looking at Mars through a telescope, and they're seeing these bright flashes, and it's like, what's that? And after that, the first cylinder comes down containing Martians, which they did not know at the time. And the cylinder falls, it makes an impact on Earth, and they're actually there, checking out the cylinder And the cylinder starts to get opened, and they're like, "There's people inside. We got to rescue them." And nothing can be further from the truth. But in Wells' story, it is the cylinders, the Martian invasion is affecting all the sons of men, all the people on Earth, humanity, humans, the residents of Earth. It is affecting them all. Whether Wells meant to distinguish, people who believe in God from those who don't believe in God, it's a question. Throughout the book, to go back to what I said at the beginning, throughout the book, there's these references, there's this setting, the prayers that are offered, the overarching spiritual questions that are presented in the book, because there's these Martians coming from space, which there's no biblical framework for that. And then Wells dropping these biblical phrases in there. There's this overarching hints at the Christian ideologies that Wells incorporates. And what do we make of it all? I'm not sure, because a lot of it's not, it's not overt and it's not specific. So, thank you for watching.